Just be down at the bottom, Blaine.
There we go. Okay, so let me turn it over then to Louis and Vincent, and they can talk to us about the work that they're doing.
This is muted.
Oh, thanks. Um, just double checking, can you guys see the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Again, I just wanted to say thanks, Blaine, for the introduction, and both Vincent and I are very grateful to be here to speak. We know it's a really busy time of the semester, and so just taking time to come and listen to this. We'd love to hear your thoughts as we share some of our own perspectives that are evolving about assessing character and virtues through self-reports. So here's the outline of our talk. In the first part, we really want to think about the main way that we are approaching the assessment of character and virtues, which are self-reports, and how we typically do self-reports, in particular, a specific type of format, and some of the different limitations associated with this. In the second portion, we present our work that was funded by the John Templeton Foundation that applies multidimensional forced choice approaches to explore overcoming social desirability bias in self-reports. This work can be found in www.characterinventory.org. In the third portion, Vincent will be taking over and presenting a reconceptualization of virtues that requires assessment tools that go beyond the typical ways of self-reports. And after that, as Blaine mentioned, we'll open it up to discussion. So I'll be presenting the first two parts, which is, in my view, the more mundane part, and the more exciting part, Vincent will be presenting. And we look forward to, again, hearing what everybody thinks about this work. So in the first portion, I want to talk about the need to go beyond typical self-reports of character and virtues. And as I understand, not everyone here is a psychologist, so it's helpful to have a quick overview of, I believe, how psychology has come to embrace character and virtues. So early in psychology, as the field really sought to establish itself as a science and clearly demarcate it from pseudoscience, as many of us know, the dominant paradigm in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, was logical positivism, where only statements that are testable and verifiable are meaningful. And unobservable things like God, ethics, virtues were deemed unverifiable and perhaps even meaningless. And this is exemplified by Gordon Allport, one of the founders of personality psychology, who stated, which I believe many of us know, this phrase: character is personality evaluated and personality is character devaluated. So it was believed that character should not be studied because it's value laden, but personality can be studied. Of course, if we start looking back, we realize that, well, personality is also value laden. In fact, as an organizational psychologist, we use character assessments, or personality assessments, should I say, to select people for jobs because there are certain personality traits that are valued within organizations. With the decline of logical positivism, I think psychology became much more open to evaluable ideas like well-being, character, ethics, and virtues. And as Blaine and colleagues note in their recent paper, more researchers are recognizing that it's not possible to eliminate evaluation from psychology. And I believe Christian is here, and he talks about the world of evaluation. And as we think about even character and personality, there are hundreds of virtue-like terms or derogatory terms or adjectives used to describe people. So it's inevitable that we apply scientific principles to understand it. Or as Blaine talks about, we need to be evaluation bullet biters to openly incorporate these values and value commitments. And one of the impetus toward character and virtues in psychology, which I'm more familiar with, is positive psychology, and a number of you here as well, I believe, familiar with that So this was launched in 1998 by Marty Seligman, who stated that positive psychology is the science of positive subjective experience, positive individual traits, and positive institutions that promises to improve quality of life and prevent pathologies that arise when life is barren and meaningless. And I highlighted positive individual traits because within positive psychology, really positive individual traits has been primarily viewed in terms of character and virtues. And so in 2004, Peterson and Seligman put together a handbook of character strengths and virtues published by the American Psychological Association. And this handbook is viewed as the UNDSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and explicitly opens the possibilities to study human potentials and strengths, particularly strengths of character and virtues. However, there are clear limits to positive psychology, as Blaine has talked about in the emerging science of virtue, and virtue research in its own right is now becoming a distinctive field in psychology and has grown in the past 20 years. And psychology has drawn on a lot of these philosophical underpinnings, and Vincent will elaborate a little bit more, but for now, we just think about character in terms of hexes, right, in terms of disposition or stable traits, but really it's more of a sense of active disposition. So not merely feelings or impulses, but something that is trainable and developable, such as understanding such that it will not be forgotten. And then in terms of virtue, it's arete, so excellence that can exist in animate or inanimate objects like, for instance, a knife, something that can be honed as a skill that even results in us gaining pleasure from it. So while psychology often draws on these philosophical underpinnings, the interesting thing is that we often treat character and virtues as extensions of personality research. So think about what Gordon Allport talked about. Character is personality evaluated. And Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi, also Peterson and Seligman talk about positive individual traits, right? So really seeking to understand or conceptualize and operationalize character and virtues in those ways. So basically it's viewed as some kind of positive dispositions of individuals. And here, character is often treated as lower order traits, where virtues, so they are underlying virtues, and virtues are treated as higher order traits comprising of character traits. And there is the famous Via and Bob McGrath. I saw him here and he can talk more about this, but this is a great taxonomy just to think about how character underlies virtue, right? So here we have just two virtues, wisdom and courage, and you can see the different character traits underlying the broader virtue classification. And there are 6 virtues, but I'm showing just 2 virtues here underlying character strengths. Vincent and I have also developed, based on this 6 virtues, when we first started work on this character traits and virtues in 2013, we really drew upon this dominant view with virtues construed as higher order traits, right? So this is kind of, again, from that personality or trait approach tradition, where we basically found 8 virtues and 31 character traits, and later, we reduced it to 29 because of issues of replicability. We basically found 29 character traits. But again, this idea is that there are character traits underlying virtues. We have since then, I think, evolved in terms of our thinking on this issue, but we'll share a little bit more as we go along. So like personality, character and virtues assessment relies primarily on self-report methodology. So I believe many of us are familiar with this. So often when you ask a participant to respond to a, let's say, character assessment, something like gratitude, you ask them, do you appreciate the things that you have? To what extent do you agree with this? Or to what extent does this describe you? Strongly disagree to strongly agree. The problems with this specific type of format is that it can lead to a lot of potential issues, such as in general self-reports about self-accuracy. Do people know whether they are grateful, let's say, if that's something that you're interested in, and are they aware of their different behaviors in different contexts, for instance. So this issue of self-accuracy more generally. In particular, we're more interested in this talk really for the first part in terms of self-presentation biases. So the self-enhancement, or some people call it fake good. How can we overcome some of these self-enhancement biases, particularly as institutions like colleges and work organizations are seeking to use these tools to assess applicants? And then Vincent will be talking about the third point, which is, are virtues actually equals to character? Is it specifically evaluated personality? So in the second section, we are really focusing on a multidimensional forced choice format of character assessment. Other researchers have explored different perspectives, like using other reports, for example, and I think that's great. But here we're just going to be focusing on a multidimensional forced choice approach. The reason being that there are practical advantages to self-reports. It's actually pretty easy to implement, and it's cost-effective as well. So as organizational psychologists, when we develop many of these instruments for selection and promotion, they need to be easy to implement and cost-effective. And they also need to provide valuable information that predicts outcomes that can stand legal scrutiny. So using other reports can have other problems. Can you hold on for a moment? I think my kid is banging on the door. Oh, Zoe, I'm sorry you have a nosebleed. Zoe, Daddy's having a talk right now. Can you wait for Daddy, all right? Thank you. Sorry, my kid was having a nosebleed. Joys of homeschooling. All right, so where was I? Yes, I think that I was just talking about some of the practical advantages of self-reports, and particular we're exploring a multidimensional forced choice approach. One of the things, as I mentioned, as we've seen with typical way that we assess character is through what we call a single statement assessment. In this example here, I'm strongly committed to principles of justice and equality, strongly disagree to strongly agree. It's very transparent what the quote unquote correct answer is, especially in a high stakes situation, right? So it's very easy to self-present. Whereas in what we call a multidimensional forced choice approach, here we have people actually rank the following statements, which tap into different character strengths. So here, for instance, rank the following statements in the order which describes you from least like me to most like me. So A, I'm committed to the principles of justice and equality. I forgive others when they make mistakes. I express thanks to people who care about me. I look on the bright side of life. So individuals now have to choose between multiple good options and think through which is most like them and which is least like them. Now, despite the format being ipsative, using advanced measurement techniques, really psychometrics, it's still possible to obtain normative scores and compare individuals on each of these traits. So we can obtain actually the properties of the statements, statistical properties of the statements being ranked, and score participants as they work through these different multidimensional forced choice blocks. And this multidimensional forced choice approach is actually not new and used in high stakes contexts for personality assessments. So here we're actually adapting it for virtues. And it has been shown to actually reduce the mean shifts from responding honestly versus asking respondents to self-present in the best possible way. And using the multidimensional forced choice format, we actually recover the same trait scores, but then these shifts are actually lower compared to the single statement approach. So this initial work was funded by the John Templeton Foundation. And as I mentioned, you can find it on characterinventory.org. We used the framework developed by Peterson and Seligman of 6 virtues and the 24 character traits underlying these 6 virtues to first generate relevant statements and then have respondents respond to these statements. So really scale creation of single statement scales. We conducted 5 studies to do this and had about 3,600 participants. We validated the scales and then we finalized these single statement scales. And this work was published in Journal of Positive Psychology. Using factor analysis, we actually found 8 virtues, which later on we call character cores. And we can talk a little bit about this later in our discussion. Because now I think the way we're thinking about virtues is slightly different from character traits, as really thinking about it coming from the personality tradition. And this finalized scale comprised of 211 items. And here we see the 8 character cores and then 31 character traits. And as I mentioned, we've dropped it to 29 in our final scale. Using this final scale, we then developed the multidimensional forced choice item blocks. So as you can see here in this figure, we first did item response modeling to obtain statistical characteristics of the items. So in psychometric parlance, it's really item loadings on a construct and how single statements relate to the underlying character core concept. We also looked at item social desirability. So we assessed social desirability by having participants in 2 conditions, one answering honestly versus presenting oneself in the best light. This created differences in the 2 conditions that indicate the extent individuals self-present on a statement. Using these 2 pieces of information, we then could create the multidimensional forced choice blocks that are balanced on social desirability and then also the level of item statistical characteristics as well. We conducted also a simulation study to reveal that the 13 character traits can be actually used to estimate the 8 virtues well. So we basically selected 13 character traits that are most representative of the 8 virtues based on statistical information and content coverage. So the last portion obviously is to create the multidimensional forced choice measure. We reduced the number of blocks through pilot testing from 90 blocks to 30 blocks. And remember, in each block, participants are supposed to rank order these different virtue statements or character core statements. And then we examined the multidimensional forced choice measure relative to the single statement items to examine their psychometric properties and whether they are indeed so-called more resilient to self-presentation. There's a lot of nuance in all of this, but for the sake of time, I'm only including some of the main points. Takeaway from the final findings is that the multidimensional forced choice measures of 8 virtues correlate, or character cores correlate well with the single statement measure of virtues, indicating that we're able to assess quote unquote virtues normatively and other established measures of character using single statement formats as well. Further, when we look at the nomological network of the multidimensional forced choice measure compared to the nomological network of the single statement measure, that is, with the multidimensional forced choice nomological network, which is correlated to personality and other behavioral scales, so think about that as a network, versus a separate network where you have this single statement measures and the network. If you look at these 2 networks and you kind of look at the correspondence, it's very, very high. It's 0.94. So there is correspondence even in using these multidimensional force choice measures, we are able to recover partially normative scores of virtues or character cores and compare it with the single statement ones. However, the thing is, it did not actually appear to be more faking resistant than the single statement measures. And one of the reasons here, remember, as I mentioned, with personality, we've used these multidimensional force choice approaches before. With character, what we realized is that we also needed to include negatively worded items or frame it as negatively worded in many cases in order for the model to work. With personality, there are some aspects of personality that I think are less socially desirable. So you don't actually need to do as much of that. And I think that might have led to some issues with trying to create so-called the reduce the bias in terms of self-presentation. But again, this work really led us to start to think a little bit more about the nature of character and virtues. And I'll hand it over to Vincent, who will be presenting part 3 here.
All right, thank you, Louis. Excuse me. I'm gonna try to set up my screen. Hopefully you guys will be able to see it. I just connected my second monitor here, and I hope once I get that set up. Okay, can everyone see the slides now? Awesome. Okay, so thanks, Louis. So yeah, during this time as we were kind of working on this John Templeton Foundation grant and trying to develop these scales to kind of overcome self-presentation biases and things of that sort, kind of in tandem during that time, I was becoming, we were becoming more familiar with the literature and kind of swimming a little bit more upstream and kind of reading more of the source materials, like obviously Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but then also other philosophers who have been kind of elaborating on his ideas for many, many years. And over time, that kind of led to this other idea that maybe we might be asking the wrong question in the first place. So let's dive into this section, going beyond general tendencies. So up until this point, as Louis has pointed out, the entire project, I guess, of kind of revivifying character research and framing it in terms of character traits in virtue assessment has been grounded in kind of the personality science literature and where it's been and where it's ultimately arrived at, right? This kind of predominant character measurement approach that we've been taking is grounded in that. And I would characterize this, broadly speaking, as like the trait paradigm. Right. So generally speaking, when you have measures of character that you look at, it's something like a global assessment. So that would be a very traditional kind of general measure where they're asking you, typically speaking, on average, in general, over a very large time span over the course of maybe 3 months or a year, how often do you engage in these behaviors? Or, do you agree, to what degree do you agree that you engage in these very representative, maybe perhaps even extreme examples of trait relevant behavior? For example, with authenticity, you might have a number of statements like, I am generally honest with others, all the way down to, I do not change how I present myself depending on who is around me, right? And then people would rate themselves. And then ultimately you would arrive at some sort of score for the trait standing. Usually that's something like a sum score across all the items or an average across all the items. And that makes a lot of sense when you're defining the thing that you're measuring, the construct that you're measuring, in that very specific way, when that connection between conceptualization and operationalization is very clear. For example, when you're talking about a personality trait, you're saying that's represented as, or is a dispositional tendency to engage in certain trait relevant thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So when you're talking about a general tendency, while general may be cross-situational and a tendency might be an average. So it makes sense to ask people to mentally aggregate across all the situations in which they might express this personality trait and then average that itself, 2 forms of aggregation, to arrive at standing on the trait itself, essentially treating any sort of variation around that ultimate score as measurement error. A more recent approach grounded in Wolf-Leesen's work on the density distribution of personality states, characterizing a personality trait as not a single point in standing on that, you know, latent continuum, but rather the entire if you were to sample people on their behavior, ask them to maybe do a daily diary study or use experience sampling method, and, you know, target at least one, if not more, specific behaviors, have them rate themselves on that trait relevant content, item content, over many assessments, let's say, and then you'd have a distribution of what would be called personality states. Well, that entire distribution would be the personality trait, but the trait standing itself would be the average of that distribution. Ultimately, in either case, you're ultimately saying that the average behavioral expression represents their standing on that construct of interest, on that trait of interest. And I guess the fundamental question then becomes, is that how virtues as laid out, you know, and specified in certain traditions, let's say the Aristotelian or the Neo-Aristotelian tradition, is that how virtue relates to its behavioral manifestation? And I would suggest not. But in the next slide here, let me just show you.
Hey, Vincent.
You're probably very familiar.
Vincent, can you hear me? Hey, people are saying that they're seeing the presenter slides rather than
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how to, maybe if I switch, okay. Maybe if I switch this around to the, maybe I'll just, sorry, maybe I'll just do this without the notes then. Okay, sorry about that. Technological hiccups, of course. Here we go. Let's try this again. Okay, so from current slide. Sorry, I was having problems hearing it because I had feeding into my headphones. Anyway, so this trait approach here, you have relevant thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and let's see, have people rate themselves on that, whether, again, that's a global assessment type of item or specific behaviors that are then rated on that item content. People go ahead and rate themselves, and then you arrive at some sort of, you know, average or some score for the trait itself, maybe, you know, across all these different behaviors, generally speaking, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that might represent or be relevant to this trait. Then you average across, and now you have some sort of trait standing. And this, I think, kind of harbors this certain assumption about, again, how this construct relates to its behaviors, which is that the reference point, you could say, is the bottom end of the scale. And to the degree that you depart from the bottom end of the scale is the degree that you have that amount of that construct. So the more that you are from the bottom end, the more that you have of that thing that you're measuring. And by implication, the closer you are to the top end, the more that you have of that thing, whatever construct you're talking about. Again, I think this works perfectly fine for personality traits. Now, diving into kind of the philosophical literature, this kind of what should be, I guess, grounding our approach, arguably should be grounding our approach. There should be, I guess, some grounding in theory, and you know, I'm drawing from the Aristotelian or Neo-Aristotelian theory as I understand it. As I learned more about it, and I saw how people were kind of talking about it and explaining, I think, what Aristotle was talking about, because I don't think he's always 100% clear, because I believe these Nicomachean Ethics were his notes that he was using for teaching. So I don't think he was trying to write a book necessarily. But like there's the idea that the virtue is defined by the doctrine of the golden mean, or really, as I came to understand it, that there are really, it's two doctrines, two distinct theses, that when you're defining any given virtue at the conceptual level, you can say that a virtue lies at the golden mean between the vices of deficiency on one hand and excess on the other. So I would say this might be characterized as the conceptual golden mean, right? So on this kind of imaginary latent continuum here, we would have, let's say, courage lying at the golden mean between the vices of deficiency, the vice of deficiency, cowardice, but also the vice of excess, foolhardiness. So that would be somewhere there. But at the same time, there's this other doctrine of the golden mean, this related, I guess, sub thesis, which is what I would characterize as the operational golden mean, how virtues would manifest in behavior. And Aristotle talked about how actions themselves admit to means, to the intermediate condition, and they also have, you know, vices of deficiency and excess. And what is important is finding that intermediate action. However, what is considered intermediate, is not a point equidistant between the vices of deficiency and excess, but rather depends on the particularities of the situation. So I thought that was really interesting and really important, because actions in one situation, perhaps one that is very moderate in absolute degree, might be characterized as courageous in that particular situation. But then, in a different situation, a lower level in absolute terms might be characterized as appropriately courageous, and anything above and beyond that might be considered increasingly foolhardy. And I think this necessarily follows from those 2 points that, the golden mean defines, at least with respect to actions, as a degree that is not too excessive or deficient. So it's going to be somewhere in the middle, usually. But then also, if it depends on the particularities of the situation, then the action that is considered optimal or intermediate or virtuous necessarily must vary across situations. If it depends on the particulars of the situation, it can't be the same absolute level across all the situations. And if that's the case, then it is necessarily not the case that the top end, the most extreme version of virtue-relevant behavior, is virtuous across all situations. So on the left, we have the trait approach, or what I ended up calling the trait operationalization of virtues approach that we just kind of covered earlier. And then on the right, we're offering this kind of alternative measurement approach, the golden mean operationalization of virtues approach, where we're trying to ahead of time specify what would be considered intermediate in behavior for specific situations, then see the degree that people are hitting them or not hitting them. And to the degree that they are hitting that or meeting what is optimal in those situations, then they have a very high degree of that virtue. In other words, it is not about how far away you are from the lower end of the scale. It's about how across different situations that might be sorted or categorized by the absolute level that is considered optimal, how often they are consistently meeting the optimal across these different situation types, again, differing by what absolute level is considered optimal for that situation type. If they don't depart across all these different situation types, then they have a high degree of virtue. So this is a figure from the paper itself. And for this first panel A, it's trying to explain the too much of a good thing effect. It's actually the thing that got me interested in kind of reading deeper into the philosophy and understanding where this all came from in the first place. It was a paper by Grant and Schwartz in 2011, Perspectives on Psychological Science. They basically used the VIA framework and said, well, if these are the broad categories of virtues, and then character traits are the discrete roots of manifesting those virtues, then this is kind of a classification scheme whereby we can look at the literature, look at empirical relationships between traits that could be characterized into these 6 broad virtues, and look at the relationship between the relation between these character traits as well as outcomes. For example, well-being of different sorts, as well performance of different sorts. And they found that there was in their research a curvilinear relationship, such that at high levels of these of standing on these character traits, that there would be decrements to or decreases in performance or different types of well-being. And that led them, this sort of empirical evidence was the empirical basis for them to conclude that one can have too much virtue. And that was, I think, in some ways the genesis of this very this growing research on the too much of a good thing effect, or the bright side of dark traits or the dark side of bright traits. And that really kind of was stuck in the back of my mind. It kind of gnawed away at me, because the conclusion that one can have too much virtue didn't really make a lot of sense to me. Because if virtue is defined by excellence, then how can one be too excellent? And that really just was, just there, sitting there. And I tucked it away in the back of my mind. As I'm learning more about this, I should probably try to solve this paradox. And we went through the development of these different single statement or single stimulus measures, self-report measures, as well as the MFC, the multidimensional forced choice measures. And then as over time, I started to think, I think I'm getting a handle on what is causing this issue. It's construing virtues as traits in the first place. And so I think the too much of a good thing effect, this kind of idea that one can have too much virtue, only makes sense if you assume that virtues are traits or can be measured using the trait approach. So in this first panel, panel A, I want to point your attention to the top line across all three individuals, we have persons A, B, and C. The top line under each person is the TOV approach, the trait paradigm approach, where they're taking the average of absolute levels of behavioral expression, trait relevant behavioral expression, and that is their standing from their perspective on that trait of interest. In this case, we might be trying to measure virtue using this trait paradigm approach. Underneath that, we have our golden mean operationalization of virtues approach, where we're breaking down situations, again, into situation types. That defined by situations are sufficiently similar enough that they belong to a situation type, where that situation type is defined by what optimal level, the same absolute level of virtue relevant behavior is optimal for that situation. So we're assuming for any given virtue that there's three situation types that differ in absolute levels of trait relevant behavior that would be considered optimal. And we're assuming that each person is encountering each of these three different situation types an equal amount of times. Therefore, the average is going to be an unweighted average across all those three situations. But as you note, the only virtuous person I'm sorry, let me give you more about the symbols here. At the top line, the diamond shape is the average across the circles underneath. The circles represent the absolute level of virtue relevant behavioral expression in each of the three situation types. And then within each situation type, situations 1, 2, and 3, there's an X along that scale, and that X represents the optimal level of virtue relevant behavior that would be considered optimal or intermediate. In other words, the virtuous level, the virtuous action that should be hit if one were truly virtuous. Now, you can see that only person B in the middle here is hitting the optimal level across all three distinct virtue salient situation types. Therefore, they are, by the standards of the golden mean measurement approach, the most virtuous person. Whereas person A is, for each situation type, deficient across all three situation types. Whereas person C in their circles are above or excessive in all three situation types. However, if you were to use the trait operationalization of virtues approach, you would think that person C is the most virtuous because their average virtue relevant behavior is the highest among the three. Person B is moderately virtuous, and person A is the least virtuous and deficient in some way. So I think that kind of gets at the heart of the issue, is that when you use averages, you're really kind of treating the very information that's a necessary virtue assessment, which is variation or variability in behavior, as measurement error, number one. And one of the consequences of using this kind of trait paradigm approach is that it builds into it rigidity. In other words, if the persons at A and C who are at the most extreme are rigid in their behavioral expression, the higher you are, the more close you are to either end of the scale, the more necessarily it is the case that behavioral expression cannot vary. And variation is fundamentally necessary for hitting the optimal. And as we've talked about, as I believe the way that I'm understanding Aristotle, the optimal depends on the situation. It's going to be different from situation to situation. So I think for the sake of time, I'm not going to go, maybe I'll talk about it later, but that's, I won't go into the assessment elements I wanted to mention either. But variation is necessary. That brings me, sorry, so that's that. That brings me to the panel B. And I'm going to illustrate these using the principle of equifinality, which is the idea, generally speaking, that different starting conditions can lead to the same endpoint. In this case, different underlying behavioral expressions can lead to the same trait score. So in panel B, we see that there's persons D, E, and F, and they vary. They vary in their behavior across these three situation types. But note also that using the trait paradigm approach, they all have the same exact middling standing, the same exact moderate standing using the trait approach. So the point here is that simply being moderate in your trait standing is also not enough, and it's insufficiently informative to say that you don't want to be too extreme on your trait standing, because all three have the same trait standing for fundamentally different reasons. Person D is being rigid moderately. They're having a moderate behavioral expression across all three situation types. Person E is, hitting the mark in situation 2, but missing it in situations 1 and 3. And person F, same thing with situation 2, but again, missing the mark in situations 1 and 3. And the point is they are actually having the same trait standing as the truly virtuous person B, that middling approach, but for fundamentally different reasons. So you need to model, I think, the situations, and more importantly, what is considered the optimal level within situations to be able to assess virtue. Yeah, so variability in behavior is important, and as I've mentioned, there's been advances in character research, taking that approach, taking the density distribution approach, or the whole trait theory was an expansion on that, incorporating social cognitive mechanisms approach. But I think beyond that, you need to model the situations themselves and what is considered optimal, because as I mentioned, you know, this person D, they're just moderate across all 3 situations. That's clearly the issue that persons A and C had. They're just rigid. They're not responsive to all 3 situations, the factors that would inform them about what is virtuous across those situations. But it's also not the case of being as variable as possible, like person F, the most variable of any person in this figure, is good. Variability is not good enough in and of itself. It's just a necessary but insufficient condition for hitting the optimal, because the optimal is different from situation to situation. Now, having said that, you still need to model the optimal, because person F, just like person B, has not only the same trait standing level, but they also have the same variability. So you can't even specify that there needs to be a specific amount of variability, because they have the same variation around their mean standing in absolute levels. They both have a score of 2, a score of 4, and a score of 6, just for simplicity's sake. So without reference to what is optimal in the situations in which these levels are expressed, you can't properly index virtue. Last point is the idea of multifinality, which is that the same initial starting conditions, broadly speaking, can lead to different outcomes. In this case, the same underlying virtue can lead to different trait scores. So this is probably not likely in the general population at large, but we can consider down here in panel C, person G might be, let's say we're talking about the virtue of kindness, person G might be a prison guard who is living alone and is a bit of an introvert. Person H might be someone working a typical job and has an average sized family, and person I is someone who is a kindergarten teacher with a very large family and taking care of ailing parents. And with respect to the virtue of, let's say, kindness, let's define that as being sensitive to the distress and suffering of others, and wanting to alleviate that and finding great joy in alleviating that. If all 3 people are fundamentally virtuous, but they're experiencing chronically different situations, and they happen to hit what is optimal for the situations they're chronically experiencing, well, they would be considered virtuous under the golden mean approach. They're able to perceive what is the correct or optimal level of kindness relevant behavior to express in each of these situations they're chronically experiencing, and therefore they're virtuous. But using the trait approach, someone would conclude that person I is more virtuous than person H, who is more virtuous than person G, even though along with person B, they're all equally virtuous. They're all hitting the optimal across all the situations that are kindness salient. Oh yeah, the point here is but having said that, they also differ in how variable they are in their kindness relevant behavior, and their absolute scores are different as well. So we need to kind of, I think, take this golden mean approach to virtue assessment. So in summary, I think that the thing that caused the kind of conclusion that one can have too much virtue is if we swim upstream enough, conceptualizing virtues as traits in the first place as we understand it and measure it in personality psychology. I think that when Aristotle referred to virtues as a hexis, he referred to it as a disposition, but he gave by way of example that health is a hexis. So I think it's less a trait, but it's more a state. And by state, I don't mean a momentary fleeting feeling or thought or action or something like this, but rather a condition, a state of being, right? If health is your state of being for your physical body, then I would argue that character and the virtues that may describe the domain of character is the state of being of your cultivated psyche. And that I don't think you can properly measure that using a measurement of general tendency in virtue-relevant thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Therefore, I don't think the paradigm works for measuring virtues. I think the conclusion, again, of the too much of a good thing effect is not that one can have too much virtue, but one can engage in too much or too high degree of virtue-relevant behavior. But I think Aristotle pretty much said as much in laying out his theory. And so I think a better way, and a way in which many people, philosophers and psychologists more recently, have taken to maybe construing virtues rather than as a trait, is looking at it as maybe a socio-moral skill set or socio-moral expertise. I think that requires performance-based assessment, where we are taking how people are expressing their virtue-relevant behavior against some sort of standard. And I think, funny enough, we've kind of come full circle where maybe the way to solve for social desirability bias and perhaps a memory call bias is not to make the self-report method the way that we measure virtue, and that there's a non-obvious optimal level that they should be hitting, and to the degree that they depart from that, they are lacking virtue. To the degree that they are consistently hitting the optimal level across all virtue salient situations, they are virtuous. So that is then my talk. Thanks for attending.
Great job, Louis and Vincent. That was very clear and very informative. I appreciated hearing you talk about it. Even having read the paper, it was really interesting to hear it again. And also, thank you very much for being so aware of being in the proper time. So we'll now have plenty of time for discussion. Before we go to that, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you about the conference we have scheduled for next May. Probably this group of people probably is very aware of it, but we're going to have some wonderful talks from the Jubilee Center, from the Institute for Human Flourishing, and from the Honesty Project. So that's going to be really fun next week or next month. And each of those talks will be in a 2-hour block on Tuesdays. And we spread it out thinking that would be easier for people to manage than trying to do it back to back. So we're really looking forward to those talks. And this is a great way to finish our speaker series. Also, if you have feedback or thoughts about the speaker series, should we continue it? Should we do it in a different way? You can post your thoughts on the listserv or just send them to me directly. This is the last one that we have planned so far. I'll be meeting with the steering committee before too long to revisit all of this and think about what we're going to do probably in June once we finish the conference. So we have some good fodder for discussion. So I have 4 breakout rooms set up, and I've asked 4 people to moderate those breakout rooms. And I'm going to make it down to 19 minutes for each for that, and then 19 minutes for the thing. So you'll be informed when it's over, and I'm just going to send everybody to the breakout rooms now. So Joe Mikulski, Matt Stichter, Cindy Puri, and Monica Ardelt agreed to, Kate Slaney was the 4th one, agreed to manage the breakout room. So you'll know if they take charge that they're doing so at my request rather than just being power mad. So I'm going to send you to the breakout rooms now. Have a great discussion, and I look forward to seeing you in about 19 minutes.
Passes the ball. Thank you. Like watching how many times somebody passes the ball as being a measure of their kindness or generosity, it would be much more useful to see whether or not people, behaved in similar generous ways in real life circumstances. So I come at it from a sociological perspective because that's my background. I'm very much out of my depth here. But I guess my big question is, how do we more tightly align the measurement and the study of virtue with people's actual behavioral expressions, if you will?
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Joe. Cindy, do you or your group have a quick summary for us?
Yes, as soon as I unmute myself. So we pretty quickly honed in on what we thought the biggest next step would be to figure out a way to figure out, as Amber put it, where are those circles? So where are those optimal points, and how are you going to get people to agree on that? And so there were a lot of different creative solutions that we thought long and hard about for our 20 minutes. So take them for what they're worth. But part of it was thinking about perhaps breaking it down into micro traits. And so rather than trying to get where the circles are at across a whole big broad range of things, maybe this is best compartmentalized into not only just a specific virtue, but maybe even a specific subdomain of a specific virtue, or a specific strength in some way. Barry had a really great idea about making an analogy between what's going on right now in the Floyd trial, where people are there have been some expert witnesses talking about reasonable use of force, and what most people in that situation would agree is a reasonable use of force, and thinking about the process that has come about there has already been tested, and maybe the same sort of thing could be applied to especially these micro traits that Dan suggested. And also, we talked about the idea of having panels and groups of people sort of arrive at a consensus, but that's going to prove difficult. I had some experience with that with a scale I developed with Cooper Woodard for courage, but that scale has measurement problems of its own. And then Anne talked about problems with actually going out and using these sorts of things. The scales may end up requiring a really high reading level, or the thought about lots of conditionals. And so that's going to be an additional challenge if you're trying to be so situationally focused, where you're going to have, if this and this, then this, then that complexity might end up being hard to manage. But all in all, we thought it was really cool. So
Great.
That's not to say it's not that's not to say it's really neat, but those are the challenges that we saw.
I'm noticing that we're running out of time fairly quickly. So I hope Kate and Matt won't be offended if I just jump to the whole group discussion to give everybody a chance to participate who wants to, at least in as much as we can do in 10 minutes.
No, not at all, because a couple of the points that we talked about actually were already covered a little bit by Cindy and Joe, and I think what wasn't covered, Nancy for sure will probably be willing to pipe in and talk a little bit about phronesis and the measurement of practical wisdom, which is, I think, the one of the things that was left over that hasn't been covered yet.
Okay. So questions or comments raise your hand electronically or physically.
Question.
Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering on exactly that point, Kate, and I don't know if Nancy wants to comment on it specifically, but that did come up in our discussion as well, and how we go from this phronesis and the measurement issue. So I'd love to hear thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can just summarize, and then if Nancy wants to weigh in, certainly she can if she'd like. It was a question for me, if so it came out of our discussion of this notion that there could be too much virtue, which is not, we all agreed in our group is not then virtue, it's a vice. And so virtue is connected to phronesis and practical wisdom. And so the question was being assessed in these tools in any way? And if it is, is it just something that is just merely attached onto it, like you have a practical wisdom, response scale or a set of items themselves, or is it something that's really done separately and needs philosophical tools to do? That's probably not a very good summary of what we said, but we all agreed that practical wisdom is sort of a question mark that would need to be addressed and extended out from the current framework.
Music to my ears. So I don't know if this is the correct order, but we'll go Nancy, Matt, Will, and see how we do.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Louis and Vincent, for your really interesting work. I had, I think, there were 4 points that I made in the discussion that we had in our group. And the first one is that this notion of too much virtue or too much of a good thing should be stamped off the face of the earth. That's just a total confusion And so that you guys picked up on that, I think, is a real credit to your work. If you look at book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, which is where the rubber hits the road on a lot of this, you'll find the definition of virtue that breaks it down into what you might call multi-track dispositions, that we have tendencies to deliberate well. So there's a practical wisdom component, practical reason component, motivation and affect. And if you have too little, you have the deficiency, or you have too much, the excess, you don't have virtue anymore. So with the excess, you have a failure of regulation. Practical wisdom has failed you in a certain way. So there's not too much of a good thing. There's just something that's now bad. And so that's really point number 1. And point number 2, which is connected to this, is that phronesis is really going to be key in terms of future work on virtue. And so my co-author and I, Michael Warren, we've written a book with Jen Cole-Wright on virtue measurement and have done a little bit on phronesis there and have published a paper on it. But Barry Schwartz also has a book on this. So this is something that I think is going to be the next big movement forward in virtue measurement, integrating phronesis into accounts of virtue measurement. A third thing that I mean, maybe there are 4 or 5 points, but maybe one is that you were very good about distinguishing situations and how people react differently, virtuously in different situations. But if you also look at book 2, you'll find the story of Milo the gymnast. And Milo the gymnast needs more food than I do. So what counts as a virtue in his food consumption for him would not count as a virtue for me. So I think virtue also needs to be relativized to the internal characteristics of the person, to where they're at. I thought you were coming close to that in your table C about person C, but you still didn't move into just yet the differences between people. One final thing there, I guess there's some more I could say, but I really would like to get more clarity on what you mean by optimal. What is an optimal action? So thank you very much.
Okay, let's give Matt a chance to weigh in.
Okay, thank you. I'll just say a word or two about our group and just and touch on a related point. One of the themes that sort of came up towards the end of our discussion is thinking that the gold mean approach may not be in and of itself necessary, but rather getting at some of what others like Nancy just mentioned about the different expressions and situations, and the ability to track that is what's most important. The golden mean idea may or may not be really useful to that endeavor in the long run. And it was also raised at the point that some like the whole trait theory may be able to account for that kind of variability. So there's maybe an open question about whether one needs to reject a trait model in order to arrive at what they were driving at. I was just going to second some of the what I found interesting is putting some of this emphasis on again looking at it's more difficult to do, but insofar as our ideal is to measure virtue, you are trying to get, I think, at performance measures. So that's sort of last bullet point on the slide. I mean, of course, I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that virtue should be looked at in terms of skills and when you're coming at trying to do performance measures and so forth. But as also raised in the group, those are more difficult to study in the lab and so forth. So we're also sometimes trying to get our best approximation, but that the feasibility, we don't want to lose sight of what we'd like to be able to observe ideally, even if sometimes we have to get at it in a more indirect route, but just supportive of that approach as well. So thanks.
So it's a good thing that your job is relatively modest, Vincent. Not much is being hoped for here, but really some great ideas. Will, what are your thoughts?
Unfortunately, Matt just pretty much said them all except for one, which is that we also mentioned Jen's and Nancy's and Michael's book in our group as a way to go about doing the kinds of measurement that Vincent and Lewis were talking about. So I had to remind everybody one more time of that great book.
All right, thank you. Let's give Vincent and Lewis a chance to share some of your thoughts or reactions to what folks have said?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just go first and then I'll pass it over to Vincent. Yeah, certainly I think that, the scope of this paper, as Vincent will also say, and we've talked more as well with Blaine, that it's really just one step toward addressing the too much of the good thing issue. I don't think we're trying to say that trait approaches should never be used. I think certainly we just want to say that, hey, we need to recognize that when we use a trait approach, at least in how we typically think of it, it leads to the too much of a good thing effect. And that's paradoxical to how we, I think about virtue as excellence or goods in themselves. The challenge that, as we talked, is that, how do we go about then doing so-called a situation-specific optimality approach, right? What is exactly is optimal, and are there other aspects besides performance? And we've talked about things like, maybe you could look at more cognitive or knowledge type approaches, like the defining issues tests, or, in IO psychology, we look at situational judgment tests. In terms of how Igor Grossman more recently looks at wise reasoning, where he has people using ESM report on situations that experience, write a narrative on that, and then have coders with a frame of reference training rate those experiences and how they actually went about wise reasoning. So those are things that can be examined, but I think that it's still lacking in several significant ways, as mentioned by Nancy and others as well. Like in terms of motivational and effective, we're not necessarily capturing those aspects, right? So certainly, even if you have the right behavior, do you have the right motivations and the right direction in which you are trying to engage in those behaviors, and exactly what exactly is optimal in that way, that is also challenging. But certainly I think by opening this up in these ways, it allows us to start thinking more concretely about how we are operationalizing virtues if we truly intend to measure virtues. So Vincent?
Thanks, Lewis. Yeah, I think those are all really good points. I was trying to take notes and organize my thoughts here. So yeah, I think I agree that this is actually part of a larger paper that we had to basically break down. And this is basically step one in the overall, what I would call the overall assessment procedure in ultimately measuring virtues, which I think is an incredibly difficult but worthwhile task. And I think the point of this first part, I guess, this paper by itself, is how would you measure the behavioral manifestation of virtues, however you want to ultimately define whatever that is that you're measuring. I'm of the mind that I really like, some of the schools of thought of like back in the day of how to measure wisdom, like the Berlin paradigm of wisdom research, where they construed what they're measuring not as wisdom per se, but as wisdom-related performance, recognizing that there's a degree of separation between what you're measuring and which is the performance of behavioral manifestations, let's say, of a given virtue versus the virtue itself. That part is something I want to dive into and develop more with Lewis as we move into the second and third, maybe we'll make that just one paper, part about these other relevant aspects of measuring virtue, which is things like the knowledge. Are you aiming for the right thing? The motivation, are you doing it for its own sake, and that sort of stuff. And that, I think, is the overall entire project of virtue assessment in its entirety. This is just more, I would say, maybe the performance-based measurement. How would that look? How would that show up in behavior? So yeah, so the key point again is optimality. How do we, big $1 million question, how do we define optimality? How do we sort these situations by optimality? So in the paper, I basically recommend 3 strategies, and I think the first 2 are most relevant to establishing that the top end of the scale is not always the optimal, right? So the first part is, if we were to take, let's say, some subject matter experts, this is how we do in IO psychology, we have people that are considered experts in the area of interest, in this case, in Aristotelian virtue ethics, if you want to ground your research in that, which I do, I think, and people who are very familiar with that literature, and basically provide them a way to specify whether the top end is always virtuous. So I was thinking using a vignette study, we present them different items, but in this case, let's have vignettes where things are are varied. So, and some things are held constant. For example, I would say that when it comes to the virtue of, let's say, courage, the most extreme behavioral manifestation of that might be risking one's life. So if we were to hold that constant, we gave each expert in Aristotelian philosophy a scale. It's like, okay, so this is what we're holding constant, this behavior, and then expressed in this situation, would you consider this cowardly, courageous or foolhardy? So risking one's life in a situation where you could save humanity itself, that might be, by most people's lights, considered courageous. But then if in a different situation, I guess to paraphrase the great American philosopher, comedian Chris Rock, if you were to risk your life because someone scuffed your Puma, what kind of worthwhile or maybe morally worthwhile end can you really derive from that specific situation from risking your life? And I would guess that the vast majority of people in general, and also Aristotelian philosophers in particular, would agree that that is a foolhardy thing to do. So now that we've established essentially that the top end of the scale in behavioral expression is not always virtuous, the virtuous action, given situation particularities, we could then maybe move on to a different approach where we actually have people experience sampling method in situ, ping throughout the day and asking them to rate their current behavior on two scales. One is the traditional Likert type scale that we're all familiar with very much disagree to very much agree on virtue relevant item content. But then right afterwards, to use this other scale that's developed by Robert Kaiser, the too little, too much scale, which itself is grounded in Aristotelian theory, ranging from -4 to +4, where -4 is too little, +4 is too much, and 0 is just right. And then if we can correlate those two sets of scores for each person's behaviors, virtue relevant behaviors, if we could find that people don't always think that the most extreme behavior is the most optimal, the most virtuous, and they actually say that it is too much given whatever situation that they're in, in that case, we don't really need to even model the situation particularities. We just know that they're agreeing that, in fact, I'm in these situations, and even I think that this is excessive for the situation that I'm in. And that's another way. And, there's plenty of research done by Rob Kaiser himself to show something similar. Like he has done research on the Strengths Finder, which actually the VIA is based in. Actually, the roots of the VIA is based on the Strengths Finder, but he actually had CEOs rate themselves on these two scales. This very idea, I cite him, doing that, and he found that a lot of CEOs were leaning on their strongest strengths, and very much agreeing that they're doing those behaviors, but simultaneously their subordinates or direct reports said that they're engaging in those behaviors too much, and they themselves agreed when they're using that kind of too little, too much scale. So that's a second approach to finally establishing that the optimal is not always the top end of the scale. And then I think, in practice, how do we go about doing this? I think like a criterion related research strategy would basically to figure out, and this is got to be a lot of conceptual work done, but there's some sort of, I think, good or value internal to, and I need to read more McIntyre after virtue. I need to go back and reread that to really get down into the nitty gritty of what he meant by that. But like, there is some value that is worth aiming that is internal to the virtue itself. So for something like kindness, it might be the alleviation of suffering. For courage, it might be the attainment of a perhaps morally worthwhile end. And then the question is the most extreme virtue relevant behavior in every situation the thing that's most likely to bring about the good internal to that virtue? And I think the answer is no. And in Nancy Snow's book, Virtue, I believe the title's Virtue as Social Intelligence, she reviewed a very, I cited it in the paper, you can take a look at it, I think it's page 93 or something, 90 something, where they're trying to alleviate, these people are in a party and like, I don't want to go, it's going to take too long, but long and the short of it is they're trying to alleviate this something, trying to be kind, but sometimes the most kind behavior, objectively speaking, actually undermines the project of alleviating the suffering of the person in that situation. So what is virtuous and optimal will be to find that maybe middling or lower degree in absolute terms that actually brings about the good internal to that virtue and therefore is the most optimal. So those are, I guess, three sub-answers to the question of optimality.
That's great, Vincent. I'm going to take the risk of being unkind. that there is never enough time. And one of my favorite things about such nerdy groups as this is that we have so much to say and so much to talk about. And people have really cool ways of thinking about things. And this is really a phenomenal group. I think it says something about your paper and who you are, that so many fantastic people came and joined this talk, and that we're still going well after the time we appointed to end. Some people had other things they needed to do. But I'm thinking that out of respect, maybe there may be people who are politer than me who would just stay on the call as long as someone was talking. But I'm thinking we probably should wrap up at this point, and do so with a profound thank you to our speakers and to you in the audience also for coming and participating and making this a wonderful event. So I'm just I'm delighted by this.
Thanks, Vincent, Lewis, and Kate and I, the Canadians. We'll stay here all day because we're very polite, and we just.
That's the only reason, right?
We're too polite to say anything else.
On the trait list, that's the highest priority.
I've been living on the East Coast for a long time, so I left all that behind.
Thank you, Lewis and Vincent. That was a really wonderful presentation, and everyone for the wonderful discussion. I'm also very pleased, Blaine. I think this has just been great.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Take care, everyone.
Very good. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah. Thanks again for another really wonderful session.
Good to see you, Blaine.
Yeah, you too, Matt. It's I'm thinking, I'm looking at these people. I want to have a conversation with everybody who's here.
I know.
You were one, Amber was another one. I mean,
Someday soon.
either of you for a long time, and it's just fun to see you again.
Yeah. Looking forward to conferences and being in person again.
Yeah, it'd be more fun to sit next to you at a conference and have lunch together, or
Exactly.
still remember those Vietnamese sandwiches we got in Salt Lake with Amber too. It was really fun.
Oh, were you there too? Was that at the same time?
Yeah, my students, we were at some meeting, I think a theoretical psychology meeting.
So Matt, you were Blaine's student?
No, Matt wasn't there. No,
okay.
No, I wasn't there for that one. That was a different.
Oh, I was confused because I was like, okay, I know Matt looks a little bit familiar, but I didn't remember him being in Salt Lake. Okay.
Well, Matt, Amber, Matt.
Nice
Matt.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I thought, well, I shouldn't get started because then I won't stop. But yeah, it was good. I loved this presentation. And Blaine, thanks for putting this network together. It's been fantastic. So
much fun. Yeah. So if you haven't seen it so far, Matt, Amber has a podcast on moral science.
Oh, nice.
You.
A lot of people have talked, and you could interview Matt. He'd do a great interview too.
Okay. I need more interviewees. I've sort of dropped the ball on it this year with the pandemic, but I'm trying to pick it back up, and I'm supposed to interview Jonathan Haidt this month if he doesn't cancel, which will be interesting. So we'll see what happens there, but I'm looking forward to getting to interview him. And yeah, Matt, if you're interested,
well, that sounds fun.
Open invitation.
I stick with my recommendation of Matt.
Oh, thank you. Be happy to.
Cool.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I wish I had unfortunately, a lot of times I had other time conflicts, but I think for a lot of the upcoming talks and so forth, my schedule is clear now, especially since once it gets past this